Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So my talk is about visual perception and how to effectively use this to create um, really good user experience visualizations. And so visualizations is can be considered as a dashboard, a graph, a mobile tablet or desktop application. And so now I'm going to talk about what is visual perception. So the definition of that is the ability to interpret the surrounding environments using light in the visual spectrum to reflect how the reflection of the objects in the environment. So basically what that means is that our eyes, we interpret reflected light that comes off an object that is then sent to our brain where we transmit and able to process and then go, okay, this is an apple, this is a computer, this is a book. And so visual perception is the brain's process for organizing, interpreting visual information and then assigning meaning to it. So you can do it like that. So we have that. So then, oh, this is so much different than how I had this because I can't just use my mouse. All right. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the next slide, which kind of breaks down how do we perceive color, how do we interpret, how do we receive color. And so the way that works is that our eyes are sensitive to wavelengths, so the light. And so once we have our eyes has sense a wavelength that it can interpret, it goes to our retina. And then once it hits the retina, there are these cones, which are just photoreceptors that then in a sense, they take the wavelengths, depending if it's red, green, or blue, and then they transmit this to the brain. And so through that process, it'll transmit through the retina here, and then go to the optic nerve, and then hitting the thalamus, and then eventually getting back to the cerebral cortex where all the interpreting processes happens. What's really interesting about this is that we tend to feel that we see with our eyes, but actually we see with our brains. So our eyes are just channeling in certain signals that then are interpreted by our brain. And how our brain interprets that is how we perceive or how we see an object. Okay. And so with visual perception, it affects our memory. So there's three types of memory. There's the iconic, the working memory, and the long-term memory. And so the iconic memory is really your subconscious memory, the information process. This happens fairly quickly. It does allow you to be able to start making associations with the visual information that you're seeing, but you're not able to comprehend and process that yet. This is also what they call pre-attentive processing. And just to kind of relate this to, since we have a tech talk, kind of relate this to computers, iconic memory would be similar to like a keyboard memory buffer, the place where you'd hit the keyboard, have the input, and that will stay there until it gets moved into what we call the random access memory state. And so the next one is, I mean, I hate the fact that this is not working the way I want to, but working memory. So now we're going into the working memory. And so the working memory is actually where we do all of our all of our conscious processes happen here. In a working memory, information only retains for a few seconds to a few hours. It's got limited capacity and it's temporary. And a good example of that to relate that with the computer would be RAM, the random access, where the memory resides until the CPU starts to process that, or until you actually shut down your system, which then you would lose that stored memory. And here is the lovely associate with the RAM. And then third and last is long-term memory. So that's where information is permanently stored. This is where you're able to recall information. And with since the working memory is where we consciously process things, we will tend to grab information from our long-term memory, pass that back into our working memory, then use that memory if we have. And once we have finished with that particular information, then we either remove it completely or we place it back into our long-term memory to be able to be recalled again. And a good example of that for long-term memory would be a hard drive for a computer. Okay. And so as we visually perceive information, we tend to break things up into units or a certain amount of information, what they call chunks. Typically, we can um, store up to about 4 chunks at one time. And then once our memory, working memory is at full capacity, then it decides whether or not it's going to move one of those chunks into the long-term memory or erase that so it can add more information into it. And so the chunks would be something similar to like network or data packets, where it's just like packets of single units of data that travels along a network path. And so now I'm kind of now transitioning to Gestalt, which is a German word for form, and it means for unified and complete. And so this is a principle that we use in design that helps to build relationships between visual information. And so there's 6 principles. There's proximity, similarity, enclosure, closure. Why I'm having a brain fart on this word. All right, so I'm having a brain fart on this word for some reason, but continuity, sorry, connection. And so with proximity, which is how objects are associated as groups when they are pertaining on the pertaining on the location that they're in. So this is a good example of how you would use that on a website. So we have these cards, we built this relationship with the cards because they're close to each other, so they look like their own section or group. And then similarity is objects that are grouped with either their size, color, shape, or orientation. So size is small or big, color could be hue, it could be the shade, it could be the tint, shape could be like a circle, a rectangle, a triangle. And orientation is positioning, so it can be diagonal on the horizontal or on the vertical axis. And so here's an example of how you could use that on a website when it comes to having your products placed in the fact that the product name is at the top, but you have the description right below, and then you also have the buttons, and those are consistent with the other 3 products on there. So for similarity for a user, they would be able to see like, okay, if I look at this, I know that I'm going to first get the product name, I'm going to get the description, and then I'm going to have access to an edit or remove button. And then enclosure, where we perceive things belonging together because they form some type of order. And so in here, if you look at the left side, we've got the 4 cards, but we've got 3 cards that actually have special offer on them. And it's a little hard for us to be able to quickly decipher which cards have special offers and which one doesn't. So on the right, by actually having it as a border, and having put that down so because it could be a little hard to see, but having a border makes it a lot easier for us to quickly see that these cards have an additional relationship outside of just being in that same group. And then closure is the fact of something being open and complete or in an unusual form or shape that we're not accustomed to. We tend to want to close that, make it whole, transfer those unusual forms into regular shapes. So here's an example of using the 78%. The left one is a lot hard for us to do because it's hard for us to decipher what is the 78. Is it the big circle, the big pink circle? Is it the smaller shade of purple? And then on the right, by us having it in this circular shape, even though it's not a circle completely because it's really just a line, we will then complete that as a circle, and we look at that as saying like that's 78% complete out of 100. And then continuity is when we perceive objects that are kind of in line with each other, or they appear to continue things. And so this example here would be a couple links. And so on the left, it's like we have those three links, but they're all separated with some margin and space. Whereas the right is looks like a nav bar where that and we can just associate that these are all connecting to each other, and that we should be able to just move to the next one without having taking time to break. And because with having on the left side, with us having the three links separated, our brain has to look at the link and then interpret the negative space and then move on to the next one. And then last is connection. So here's objects that are connected with one another. So this example could be used for several other principles, but in this case, if you look at the left, there is a list of cards for products. And then on the right, it is broken up to connect 3 cards with the features and then 2 cards with the other products. And then, so now I've got 2 examples here. So one was, is this the same shade of gray? And I'm gonna give you guys like 5 seconds to look at that and see what you think before I give you the answer to it. Okay, so it is the same gray. So once again, how we visually perceive something based on a background, and this would be a good example when it comes to putting text on a background. And then in this one, it's like how many times, it's so hard to see, gosh, see it. So how many times does the number 5 appear in this list, in these list of numbers? So if you said 6, then you did a really good job. And so this is this is an example of having contrast. Even though the number 5 is has a relationship with these list of numbers, we because we added the contrast to it, it's a lot easier for us to go ahead and perceive and see that there's 6 versus having them blend in with the other numbers. So it's good to have contrast, whether that is your foreground and background, whether that is your text versus your background. And then lastly is, I'm going to give you 5 seconds. What is this? To look at this for. Okay. So this is a concept called treachery of imagery. And so this is French, where it says this is not a pipe. And so what's interesting is that people will sometimes perceive this as an actual pipe, when in fact it is a representation of a pipe. And so this is something to be conscious of when you're using images on your website. You figure out, like, am I trying to give a representation of a situation, or am I actually wanting the user to realistically experience how this works? So it's, for instance, if you had a new, like if you had a product like a computer or something, like if you show a picture, that's one perspective for them to see it. But if you actually have a video where they can see someone interacting with it, then that can be more of a realistic experience for them versus them just seeing a representation of it or one side of that computer. And last but not least, it's just information to reach out to me. I think I'm a part of Code Connector leadership. So at Coriano, I've got a LinkedIn, also my email address. And last but not least, I could not close without this.